In August 2006, a missing child report in Ohio drew immediate attention because of who the child was and what his situation involved. A 3-year-old boy with documented developmental disabilities was reported missing from a foster home, a setting assumed to be regulated, monitored, and safe. Emergency procedures were activated quickly, yet from the earliest moments there were elements that did not align with expectations. Basic questions emerged about supervision, routine, and records. How was care structured? What systems were responsible for oversight? What information existed before the report was made? At that point, the public saw only the surface, a vulnerable child unaccounted for, and a system moving into action. What remained unseen were months of administrative history and documented conditions that had never reached public view. Those early conditions did not appear dramatic or urgent on their own, but they formed the foundation of everything that followed. Understanding how Marcus Fiesel came into foster care, how his needs were recorded, and how oversight functioned before any alarm was raised, is essential to understanding the case itself. The early context explains why later events unfolded the way they did, and why questions about responsibility would extend beyond a single household. Before we continue, please make sure to subscribe. Marcus Fiesel was born in 2003 and entered the foster care system in Ohio at a young age. Authorities determined that his biological family could not provide adequate care, and responsibility for his well-being was transferred to county child welfare agencies. Marcus had documented developmental disabilities, including an inability to speak, which placed him in a category requiring consistent supervision and specialized attention. These needs were formally recorded within foster care and medical documentation. Marcus was placed with licensed foster parents in Hamilton County. The household had been approved through standard foster care procedures, and the placement was overseen by county agencies tasked with monitoring compliance with state requirements. At the time of placement, Marcus was considered to be under state protection, and his care was managed through routine administrative processes. No law enforcement involvement existed, and no emergency conditions had been declared. Records later reviewed by investigators and courts showed that concerns had been noted during the placement period. Case documentation indicated that Marcus was frequently confined to a crib equipped with a mesh covering. This method of confinement was recorded in reports and was known to individuals responsible for oversight. Medical and social service records also reflected that Marcus spent long periods isolated from normal interaction. These details were documented through formal channels rather than discovered after the fact. Despite these conditions, Marcus remained in the foster home. Reviews conducted later found that follow-up actions were inconsistent and that concerns did not trigger removal or immediate intervention. Communication between agencies was limited, and responsibility for responding to warning signs was not clearly defined. High caseload and administrative pressures contributed to delays and gaps in oversight. At the time, these issues existed within the normal operation of the system, rather than as recognized failures. Financial support associated with Marcus's placement continued under standard foster care arrangements. Required monitoring visits and reporting mechanisms were expected to ensure his safety and well-being. Subsequent evaluations would determine that these mechanisms did not function as intended. However, during this period, Marcus's status remained unchanged, and his placement was not classified as high risk in a way that prompted decisive action. It is important to note that these conditions were not publicly known at the time. Information about Marcus's care existed within agency records and professional documentation, but did not reach outside scrutiny. There were no alerts issued, no external investigations, and no public inquiries regarding his situation. The case remained within the administrative framework of child welfare services. This context highlights how systems designed to protect vulnerable children rely heavily on documentation, communication, and follow-through. In Marcus's case, documentation existed, but effective response did not follow. The gap between recognition and action would later become a central issue examined by prosecutors, oversight bodies, and policymakers. At this stage in the timeline, Marcus was not missing. There was no criminal investigation and no indication to the public that his situation was anything other than a routine foster placement. The absence of visible crisis allowed conditions to persist without interruption. When authorities later reconstructed events, these early records became essential. They showed that concerns were present and recorded, and that opportunities for intervention existed within the system. The foster placement period established how responsibility was distributed, how oversight functioned, and how administrative processes operated before any emergency response was triggered. This foundation is necessary to understand the case as it unfolded. It explains how a vulnerable child remained within a regulated system, while documented concerns accumulated without resolution. Everything that followed developed from this starting point, shaped by decisions made, actions not taken, and systems that did not escalate when they should have. On August 14, 2006, authorities in Hamilton County, Ohio, received a report that Marcus Fiesel was missing from the foster home where he had been placed. According to the information provided at the time, Marcus had been left unattended and had wandered away. Given his age, 3 years old, and his documented developmental disabilities, the report immediately met the criteria for a high-risk missing child case. Law enforcement treated the situation as urgent and activated response procedures without delay. Police officers were dispatched to the neighborhood to begin an immediate search. Standard protocol required establishing a last known location, timeframes, and supervision details. Officers canvassed the area around the residence, checking nearby streets, yards, wooded areas, and any locations accessible to a young child. Because Marcus was nonverbal, the concern was elevated. He could not ask for help or respond to his name in a way that would assist searchers. As the response expanded, additional resources were deployed. Volunteers joined organized search efforts, and search grids were established to ensure coverage without overlap. Local media outlets broadcast information about the missing child, describing his age, appearance, and vulnerabilities. The goal was to increase public awareness quickly and gather any information that could assist in locating him. During the early hours of the investigation, detectives began collecting background information. This included reviewing foster care records, medical information, and recent agency contact. Officers also conducted interviews to establish a clear timeline leading up to the report. These interviews focused on routine activities, supervision arrangements, and any unusual events. At this stage, the investigation remained centered on recovery rather than criminal suspicion. As information was gathered, inconsistencies began to emerge. Timelines provided did not align cleanly with known records. Certain details lacked corroboration through independent sources. These discrepancies were noted internally by investigators as part of routine assessment. At this point, they did not constitute evidence of wrongdoing, but raised questions that required clarification. Search efforts continued throughout the day. Officers and volunteers worked under the assumption that Marcus could still be alive and reachable. Given his vulnerabilities, the urgency remained high. Emergency services coordinated to ensure that no area of immediate relevance was overlooked. The absence of confirmed sightings increased concern, but did not yet alter the investigative classification. Behind the scenes, investigators reviewed records to determine when Marcus had last been seen by individuals outside the foster home. Documentation indicated that he had not been observed in public settings for some time. This information was part of agency records, but had not previously triggered an alert. As detectives reviewed these details, they began to question whether the reported timeline accurately reflected reality. law enforcement continued to gather physical and digital information. This included checking phone records, reviewing foster care payment activity, and examining agency logs. Each piece of information was evaluated for consistency with the missing child report. The goal was either to confirm the account provided or identify gaps requiring further inquiry. Community response remained focused on recovery. Neighbors expressed concern, and local organizations assisted with search coordination. The case drew significant attention due to the age of the child and the circumstances of his care. Public messaging emphasized the need for information and vigilance. As hours passed without results, investigators intensified their review of the circumstances surrounding the report. Questions about supervision, last verified contact, and record accuracy became more prominent. These questions were addressed methodically rather than through assumption. The investigation remained evidence-led, guided by documentation and verification. By the end of the initial response period, the search had not produced any trace of Marcus. The lack of evidence did not yet indicate a criminal act, but it narrowed the range of possibilities. Investigators prepared to reassess the situation based on the information collected and the inconsistencies identified. At this point in the timeline, Marcus was officially classified as a missing child. Law enforcement actions reflected that status. The case was still treated as a disappearance requiring recovery, but the foundation was being laid for deeper scrutiny. The reported disappearance marked the moment when administrative oversight gave way to active investigation, setting in motion the sequence of events that would follow. As the missing child investigation continued, attention shifted from search activity to verification of the information that had initiated the response. Law enforcement began a systematic review of records, timelines, and documented contact involving Marcus Fiesel. This process was routine in missing child cases, where early searches produced no results. The objective was to establish the last independently verified confirmation of the child's presence and well-being. Investigators examined child welfare documentation, medical appointments, and agency logs to determine when Marcus had last been seen by anyone outside the foster household. That review revealed a significant gap. Records showed no confirmed sightings of Marcus for several months prior to the report that he had wandered away. This absence of external contact did not align with the explanation provided to police and required further scrutiny. Detectives conducted additional interviews and cross-checked statements against administrative data. Foster care payment records, service schedules, and caseworker notes were reviewed to assess consistency. As this information was assembled, it became increasingly clear that the timeline presented could not be supported by objective documentation. The reported circumstances of the disappearance conflicted with evidence indicating long-term absence from public view. Investigators also examined the living conditions within the foster home. Prior documentation regarding confinement and isolation was revisited in light of the emerging timeline discrepancies. These records, which had previously existed within administrative files, now took on investigative significance. They provided context for understanding how Marcus could have remained unseen for an extended period without triggering immediate detection. As inconsistencies accumulated, law enforcement reassessed the classification of the case. The focus moved away from recovery operations and toward determining whether the missing child report itself was accurate. This shift did not occur abruptly, but followed a methodical process of elimination. Each potential explanation was evaluated against available evidence. When no credible scenario supported the reported wandering incident, investigators considered the possibility that Marcus had not been alive at the time he was reported missing. This determination was based on documented facts rather than inference. The lack of medical visits, absence of school or therapeutic contact, and discontinuity in agency observation created a pattern that could not be reconciled with the explanation provided. Financial records also showed continued foster care payments during the period in question, which required examination as part of the broader inquiry. Once investigators concluded that the missing child report was false, the investigation formally transitioned from a missing child case to a criminal inquiry. This reclassification reflected the conclusion that a crime had occurred, not the resolution of what that crime involved. Law enforcement notified relevant agencies and began coordinating with prosecutors to determine appropriate legal steps. The community response changed as information was updated. Search operations were halted, and public messaging shifted to reflect the new investigative focus. Authorities emphasized that the decision was based on evidence gathered during the inquiry, and that the priority had become establishing accountability and determining the circumstances surrounding Marcus's absence. Behind the scenes, investigators worked to establish what had happened and when. This required careful handling of evidence and coordination with forensic specialists. The passage of time presented challenges, as physical evidence was limited and documentation became central to reconstructing events. Every available record was examined to establish a factual sequence. The discovery that the missing report was deceptive had significant implications. It raised questions not only about individual responsibility, but also about how oversight mechanisms had failed to detect Marcus's absence earlier. Investigators documented these issues for inclusion in later reviews, recognizing that the case would extend beyond criminal charges. At this stage, law enforcement did not publicly disclose all findings. Information was released cautiously to preserve the integrity of the investigation. The focus remained on factual determination rather than narrative. Authorities emphasized that the case would proceed based on evidence and that conclusions would be reached through legal process. This phase marked a turning point. What began as a community search for a missing child had become an investigation into serious criminal conduct. The discovery of deception reframed every earlier action and record. It demonstrated how verification, rather than assumption, drives investigative progress. From this point forward, the case was no longer about locating a child, but about uncovering the truth behind his disappearance and addressing the failures that allowed it to go unnoticed for so long. After investigators determined that the missing child report could not be reconciled with documented records, the inquiry moved into a phase focused on locating physical evidence. Law enforcement coordinated with prosecutors and forensic specialists to identify where Marcus Fiesel might be found. This stage required careful planning because the passage of time limited available options and increased the importance of accuracy in evidence handling. Authorities obtained information during continued questioning that directed them to a location outside the foster home. Investigators proceeded methodically, securing the area and documenting conditions before any recovery took place. The objective was to preserve evidentiary integrity and establish a clear chain of custody. Given the sensitivity of the case and the age of the child, procedures were followed with heightened care. Marcus's remains were located and recovered under controlled conditions. The recovery process involved forensic personnel trained to handle cases where decomposition and storage conditions could affect later analysis. Each step was documented, photographed, and logged. The focus was not only on identification, but also on preserving any information that could assist in determining cause and manner of death. Forensic examination confirmed the identity of the remains as Marcus Fiesel. Medical examiners assessed available evidence within the constraints presented. Due to the extended period between death and recovery, forensic findings were limited, but conclusions could still be reached based on medical indicators and contextual documentation. The death was ruled a homicide. Medical findings indicated that Marcus had died as a result of complications associated with prolonged restraint and neglect. These conclusions aligned with previously documented conditions noted during his foster placement. The findings did not rely on speculation, but on available medical evidence and the broader record of care. The determination provided a factual basis for criminal charges. The recovery of remains marked a definitive shift in the case. It ended uncertainty regarding Marcus's whereabouts and confirmed that he had not been alive at the time he was reported missing. Investigators documented timelines based on forensic and administrative evidence to establish when death had occurred relative to recorded activities and agency interactions. Law enforcement notified relevant agencies of the findings. Child welfare authorities were informed, and internal reviews were initiated alongside the criminal investigation. The recovery prompted immediate suspension of foster care licenses connected to the case and triggered broader scrutiny of oversight practices. Public communication was handled cautiously. Authorities confirmed the recovery and identification without releasing unnecessary detail. The emphasis remained on factual reporting and procedural transparency. Community response reflected shock and concern, but investigators avoided commentary beyond confirmed findings. With the recovery complete, attention turned fully toward accountability. Prosecutors prepared to file charges based on the evidence collected, including forensic conclusions, administrative records, and investigative findings. The recovery provided the physical confirmation necessary to proceed with homicide charges under state law. This phase also underscored the limitations faced by investigators. The delay between death and discovery constrained forensic analysis and increased reliance on documentation and recorded oversight failures. These constraints were acknowledged in reports and would later be addressed in court proceedings. The recovery of Marcus Fiesel's remains represented a critical point in the investigation. It transformed a case defined by uncertainty into one grounded in confirmed facts. The focus shifted from locating a missing child to establishing responsibility for a homicide and examining how systemic failures allowed the circumstances to persist undetected. From this point forward, the case progressed within the criminal justice system. Evidence gathered during recovery and examination formed the foundation for arrests and charges. The recovery did not provide closure, but it provided clarity. It established the factual reality that would guide every legal decision that followed and anchored the case in documented proof rather than unresolved absence. With the recovery of Marcus Fiesel's remains and the medical ruling that his death was a homicide, the investigation entered a formal prosecutorial phase. Law enforcement compiled evidence gathered over the course of the inquiry, including forensic findings, foster care documentation, financial records, and statements obtained during interviews. This material was reviewed in coordination with prosecutors to determine appropriate charges under Ohio law. The evidence established that Marcus had died months before he was reported missing, and that his death had not been disclosed to authorities. Investigators documented continued foster care payments during the period in which he was no longer present. Administrative records showed that routine oversight mechanisms had not identified his absence. These findings formed a factual basis for criminal accountability. Foster parents David and Kelly Carroll were taken into custody following the conclusion that a crime had occurred. Their arrests were based on documented actions and omissions rather than speculation. Law enforcement emphasized that charges reflected both the circumstances of Marcus's death and the subsequent concealment. The arrests marked the first time the case moved from investigation to enforcement. Prosecutors filed charges that addressed the severity and duration of the conduct involved. David Carroll was charged with murder, reflecting findings related to responsibility for the conditions that led to Marcus's death. Kelly Carroll faced charges including involuntary manslaughter and child endangering, reflecting her role as documented through records and admissions. Additional counts addressed evidence tampering and abuse related to the extended concealment. The charging documents outlined a timeline supported by administrative and forensic evidence. They detailed how Marcus had been confined for prolonged periods and how his death had gone unreported. The charges did not rely on a single piece of evidence, but on the cumulative weight of documentation and findings reviewed during the investigation. Court proceedings began with arraignments and pre-trial hearings. The defendants were informed of the charges and their legal rights. Prosecutors prepared to present evidence demonstrating responsibility beyond reasonable doubt. Defense counsel reviewed the case materials and assessed potential responses. The process followed established criminal procedure. As the case progressed, both defendants entered plea agreements. These decisions occurred after review of the evidence and consultations between defense counsel and prosecutors. The plea agreements resolved the need for a full trial while preserving accountability through formal convictions. Kelly Carroll pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter and related charges. The court sentenced her to a prison term of 15 years to life. The sentence reflected statutory guidelines and the seriousness of the offense. David Carroll pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. The court considered aggravating factors, including the vulnerability of the victim and the duration of neglect. During sentencing, the court focused on legal responsibility rather than narrative interpretation. Sentencing remarks addressed public safety, deterrence, and accountability within the framework of the law. The outcomes were based on documented facts established through the investigation. The convictions brought the criminal phase of the case to a defined conclusion. Responsibility for Marcus Fiesel's death was established through legal process rather than public opinion. The sentences ensured long-term incarceration subject to parole eligibility under Ohio law. Following sentencing, attention extended beyond the courtroom. State and county agencies initiated internal reviews to assess how oversight failures had contributed to the case. These reviews operated separately from the criminal proceedings and did not alter the convictions. They sought to identify procedural weaknesses and recommend reforms. Public response to the arrests and charges reflected shock and concern. The case prompted broader discussion about foster care oversight and accountability. Authorities emphasized that the legal outcomes were grounded in evidence and that reforms would be addressed through appropriate channels. The arrests and charges phase demonstrated how an investigation transitions from fact-finding to legal resolution. It showed how documentation, preserved records, and methodical review can support prosecution even when physical evidence is limited by time. The case advanced through the justice system based on established standards, setting the stage for subsequent legal and institutional developments. With convictions secured, the case moved into a period defined by incarceration, appeals, and parole consideration. The legal responsibility for Marcus Fiesel's death had been determined, and the focus shifted toward long-term accountability and systemic reflection within the boundaries of the law. With criminal responsibility established through convictions, attention expanded to the systems that had been responsible for Marcus Fiesel's care before his disappearance was reported. This phase did not revisit guilt or sentencing. Instead, it focused on how administrative structures, oversight practices, and institutional processes operated during the period when Marcus was living in foster care. Reviews were initiated by county and state authorities to determine how documented concerns failed to result in effective intervention. Child welfare agencies examined case files, visit logs, and supervisory records connected to Marcus's placement. These reviews confirmed that information indicating risk had been recorded over time. Notes describing confinement methods, isolation, and developmental needs were present within official documentation. The issue identified was not a lack of data, but a failure to translate recorded concerns into protective action. Investigators and oversight bodies identified communication breakdowns between professionals involved in Marcus's care. Caseworkers, supervisors, medical providers, and foster care coordinators each held partial information. That information was not consistently shared or escalated. Responsibility for responding to warning signs remained diffused across roles rather than clearly assigned. As a result, no single decision point triggered removal or emergency review. Caseload pressures were also examined. Reports indicated that child welfare staff were managing high numbers of cases simultaneously. This environment reduced the time available for detailed follow-up and increased reliance on written reports rather than direct observation. While caseload volume did not excuse failures, it was documented as a contributing factor affecting oversight quality. Monitoring requirements were another focus. Foster care regulations required regular home visits and assessments of child well-being. Reviews showed that while visits occurred, they did not always include direct observation of Marcus under normal conditions. Compliance with procedural checklists did not guarantee meaningful evaluation of his living environment. This distinction became central to reform discussions. Training and guidance provided to foster parents were also reviewed. Investigators assessed whether expectations regarding restraint, supervision, and developmental care had been clearly communicated and enforced. Findings indicated that policies existed, but enforcement mechanisms were inconsistent. Documentation did not show timely corrective action when practices deviated from standards. The oversight process relied heavily on foster parents' self-reporting. This reliance created vulnerability when information provided was incomplete or misleading. Review findings emphasized the need for independent verification rather than assumption of compliance. The Marcus Fiesel case illustrated how systems based on trust require safeguards to detect when that trust is misplaced. Financial and administrative systems were examined as well. Foster care payments continued during the period when Marcus was no longer present. Payment systems were not designed to independently confirm a child's status. This gap allowed administrative processes to continue without triggering alerts. Reviews identified this as a structural weakness requiring correction. The case prompted broader evaluation of how missing child indicators were identified within child welfare systems. Marcus had not been seen by individuals outside the foster home for an extended period. That absence did not automatically generate a response. Reviews recommended improved tracking of external contact, including medical visits and service appointments, as indicators of well-being. Accountability mechanisms within agencies were also assessed. Supervisory reviews did not consistently challenge assumptions or request additional verification. Documentation was accepted without escalation. Post-case analysis emphasized the importance of supervisory oversight that actively questions compliance rather than passively records it. Policy changes followed these findings. Ohio child welfare authorities implemented reforms aimed at strengthening monitoring and escalation. These included clearer thresholds for intervention, enhanced training for caseworkers, and revised requirements for documenting direct observation. Systems were updated to improve information sharing between agencies. The case also influenced national discussions about foster care oversight. Marcus Fiesel's death became a reference point in training materials and policy reviews beyond Ohio. The emphasis shifted toward recognizing how cumulative risk factors require proactive response rather than isolated documentation. Importantly, these reviews distinguished systemic failure from individual criminal conduct. The purpose was not to assign criminal blame to agencies, but to understand how protective systems can fail despite existing policies. This distinction allowed reforms to focus on prevention rather than punishment. Public confidence in child welfare oversight was affected by the findings. Authorities acknowledged shortcomings and committed to transparency in addressing them. Reports were released outlining identified failures and proposed changes. This openness was intended to rebuild trust and demonstrate accountability. The systemic review phase underscored that Marcus's case could not be understood solely through criminal proceedings. While the justice system addressed individual responsibility, the broader examination addressed how institutional processes contributed to the conditions that allowed harm to occur. The findings emphasized that protection of vulnerable children depends on active oversight, clear communication, and decisive intervention. This phase marked a transition from legal resolution to preventive focus. It reinforced the idea that safeguarding systems must be evaluated not only after crises but continuously. The lessons drawn from Marcus Fiesel's case informed reforms designed to reduce the likelihood of similar failures in the future. Accountability extended beyond the courtroom into policy, practice, and ongoing oversight, shaping how child welfare systems approach risk, documentation, and responsibility going forward. After sentencing was imposed, the criminal court's role in the Marcus Fiesel case narrowed to procedural review. Responsibility for the crime had been formally established through guilty pleas, and the factual record created during the investigation and prosecution was no longer in dispute. What remained was verification that legal standards had been followed and that the outcomes complied with Ohio law. Because both convictions resulted from plea agreements, the range of legal challenges available after sentencing was limited. Ohio appellate courts reviewed whether the pleas had been entered knowingly, voluntarily, and with effective legal representation. Court records, hearing transcripts, and sentencing documentation were examined to confirm compliance with constitutional and statutory requirements. No factual claims were reconsidered during this review. The appellate courts found no procedural defects. The pleas were determined to be valid, and the sentences imposed fell within the ranges prescribed by law. With those findings, the convictions and prison terms remained in force. No retrials were ordered, and no modifications were made to the sentences. Once appellate review concluded, authority over the case moved away from the courts. Custody and supervision became the responsibility of the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction. David and Kelly Carroll were incarcerated under the terms of their sentences, and oversight of their status was governed by correctional regulations rather than judicial proceedings. At this point, the legal record became fixed. The evidence gathered during the investigation, the admissions made through plea agreements, and the sentencing determinations formed the permanent foundation of the case. No new information altered those findings, and no further criminal litigation followed. Prosecutors and county officials continued to reference the case within professional settings, particularly in discussions related to child welfare oversight and institutional accountability. These references did not reopen the criminal matter. They served to inform administrative reviews and policy discussions separate from the judicial process. Public attention decreased during this period. With no hearings, trials, or court rulings pending, the case largely disappeared from daily news coverage. This absence of visibility reflected the completion of courtroom proceedings rather than a lack of enforcement. The sentences continued to be carried out through incarceration. The legal aftermath highlighted how accountability operates after conviction. The justice system provided avenues for review. Those avenues were used, and the outcomes were upheld. Once those safeguards were satisfied, enforcement continued through the correctional system rather than the courts. This portion of the timeline marked the point at which legal responsibility was no longer contested or examined. The case moved forward under established rulings, with consequences enforced according to law. Later developments would bring renewed public attention through other processes, but the judicial outcome itself remained unchanged, grounded in documented evidence and lawful procedure. Years after the convictions, the Marcus Fiesel case returned to public view through the parole process. Under Ohio law, sentences of 15 years to life allow eligibility for parole consideration after the minimum term is served. Eligibility does not guarantee release. It permits review by the Ohio Parole Board under standards focused on public safety, accountability, and statutory guidance. Parole consideration is administrative rather than judicial. It does not revisit guilt, evidence, or sentencing decisions. The board reviews the established record, including the nature of the offense, institutional conduct, and assessments prepared by correctional authorities. The severity of the crime and the vulnerability of the victim are central factors in that review. When parole eligibility was reached, hearings were scheduled according to standard procedure. Records from prosecution, sentencing, and prior reviews were assembled. The board examined the circumstances documented during the investigation and the conclusions reached through the legal process. The original findings remained the foundation for evaluation. Prosecutors submitted statements opposing release. These submissions emphasized the seriousness of the offense and the responsibility established through conviction. They addressed public safety considerations and the lasting impact of the crime. Victim advocates also participated through written submissions, consistent with Ohio parole procedures. Correctional records were reviewed as part of the process. Institutional behavior, program participation, and compliance with rules were considered. These factors are required components of parole assessment, but they do not outweigh the nature of the offense itself. In cases involving homicide, particularly involving a young child, the threshold for release is high. After review, the parole board denied release. The decision cited the severity of the crime and the need to protect the public. The denial reaffirmed that the minimum sentence had not satisfied the standards required for release. The board set a future review date in accordance with policy, allowing for reconsideration at a later time. Subsequent parole hearings followed the same structure. Each review relied on the same established record. No new evidence altered the findings of responsibility. The parole board again denied release, maintaining that the circumstances of the offense outweighed factors supporting parole. These decisions were documented and made public through official announcements. Media coverage reflected the outcomes without revisiting investigative details. Authorities emphasized that parole decisions are part of a legal framework designed to balance review with public protection, not to reassess settled cases. The parole process underscored the long-term nature of accountability in serious criminal cases. While courtroom proceedings conclude responsibility, parole introduces periodic review within strict limits. These reviews do not diminish the original judgment. They function as controlled assessments governed by law. For the community, parole hearings brought renewed attention to the case. The denials reinforced the permanence of the legal outcome and the weight given to the original offense. Officials reiterated that the convictions remained unchanged and that incarceration continued under lawful authority. The hearings also highlighted how the justice system manages time. Decades may pass between sentencing and parole consideration, yet decisions remain anchored in documented facts. The passage of time does not erase responsibility or alter the seriousness of the crime. By the conclusion of the documented parole hearings, the outcome was clear. Release was denied and continued incarceration was ordered. The process demonstrated that review mechanisms exist, but they operate within firm boundaries shaped by evidence, law, and public safety. This stage of the case showed how accountability extends beyond trial and sentencing. It illustrated how legal systems maintain oversight long after convictions, applying structured review without reopening settled findings. The parole decisions confirmed that the resolution reached in court continued to guide outcomes years later, grounded in the established record and enforced through lawful procedure. After the legal outcome became permanent and incarceration continued, the effects of what happened to Marcus Fiesel extended far beyond the individuals held criminally responsible. Attention across Ohio shifted toward the systems that had been entrusted with his care and the broader responsibilities attached to that trust. The focus moved toward understanding how documented concerns failed to result in timely protection. County and state authorities reviewed child welfare records connected to Marcus's placement. These reviews examined caseworker notes, supervisory approvals, visit schedules, and internal communications. The findings showed that information describing confinement, isolation, and special needs had been recorded over time. The problem identified was not a lack of awareness within records, but the absence of decisive response when risk indicators accumulated. Oversight practices became a central concern. Agencies acknowledged that routine compliance with visit schedules did not guarantee meaningful assessment of a child's living conditions. In response, policies were revised to require clearer documentation of direct observation and greater verification during home visits. The aim was to ensure that warning signs could not be reduced to administrative entries without follow-up. Supervisory responsibility was also reevaluated. Reviews found that concerns recorded by caseworkers did not consistently prompt escalation. Changes were introduced to clarify when supervisors must intervene and what actions were required once patterns of concern emerged. This included defining thresholds for removal consideration and emergency review. Training programs for child welfare professionals were updated to emphasize recognition of cumulative risk. The circumstances surrounding Marcus's care demonstrated how individual issues, when viewed separately, can appear manageable, yet become dangerous when combined. Updated training stressed the importance of connecting information across time and agencies. Administrative systems received scrutiny as well. Foster care payments had continued without confirmation of Marcus's presence. Authorities identified this as a structural weakness and introduced cross-checking measures between financial records and case activity. These measures were designed to trigger alerts when expected interactions did not occur. The case influenced discussions at the state level regarding foster care regulation. Lawmakers referenced the findings when considering changes to oversight standards and reporting requirements. While reforms varied in scope, there was broad agreement that safeguards needed strengthening, particularly for children with disabilities who could not communicate concerns. Beyond Ohio, the case was referenced in national child welfare discussions. Professional organizations and advocacy groups used it to highlight the heightened vulnerability of non-verbal children in foster care. The emphasis was placed on proactive monitoring and the need for systems that respond to absence as a potential indicator of harm. Community trust was affected by the findings. Many residents had assumed that licensed foster placements were closely monitored. Public acknowledgement of oversight failures prompted calls for transparency and reform. Agencies responded by releasing summaries of review findings and outlining changes implemented in response. Advocacy organizations continued to engage with policymakers and agencies, stressing that meaningful reform requires sustained commitment rather than temporary reaction. Their efforts focused on resources, staffing levels, and accountability mechanisms necessary to support effective oversight. These responses did not revisit criminal responsibility. The convictions remained settled. The emphasis remained on prevention and improvement rather than blame. Authorities framed the response as an obligation to learn from failure and reduce future risk. The circumstances surrounding Marcus's absence also influenced how missing child indicators were evaluated within child welfare systems. Agencies reassessed protocols to ensure that prolonged lack of external contact would prompt immediate inquiry rather than passive documentation. Over time, the case became part of professional education within social work and child protection fields. It was used to illustrate how documentation without action can allow harm to persist. The lesson emphasized vigilance, verification, and willingness to intervene. The impact of what happened to Marcus Fiesel did not end with sentencing or parole decisions. It reshaped oversight practices, training standards, and administrative safeguards. These changes reflect an effort to ensure that vulnerability is met with active protection rather than routine processing, and that responsibility extends beyond individual cases into the systems designed to prevent harm. The resolution of the Marcus Fiesel case rests on documented investigation, legal process, and institutional response rather than narrative interpretation. From foster placement through reported disappearance, criminal inquiry, conviction, and continued incarceration, each stage followed established procedures shaped by evidence and law. The outcome did not emerge quickly, but it remained grounded in verifiable records and formal decision-making. Criminal accountability was established through investigation and prosecution. Evidence drawn from administrative documentation, forensic findings, and admissions supported charges and sentencing. The legal system addressed responsibility through guilty pleas and imposed terms consistent with statutory guidelines. Appeals confirmed that procedures were followed and outcomes were lawful. Parole review later reaffirmed incarceration based on the seriousness of the offense and public safety considerations. These steps reflect how accountability is maintained over time within a defined legal framework. Beyond the courtroom, the case prompted examination of how protective systems function. Reviews showed that documentation alone does not ensure safety. Information describing risk existed, yet action did not follow. The lesson drawn was not about the absence of rules, but about the need for decisive response when indicators accumulate. Oversight depends on verification, escalation, and clear responsibility rather than routine processing. Policy responses focused on strengthening those points. Monitoring practices were revised to emphasize direct observation and independent confirmation. Supervisory roles were clarified to ensure that concerns trigger action. Training shifted toward recognizing cumulative risk and connecting information across time and agencies. Administrative systems were adjusted to reduce gaps between records and reality. These measures were intended to improve prevention rather than assign retrospective blame. Community impact reflected a reassessment of trust. Public confidence depends on transparency and demonstrated improvement. Agencies acknowledged shortcomings and outlined changes. Advocacy efforts emphasized sustained commitment, adequate resources, and accountability mechanisms that endure beyond a single case. The aim was to ensure that vulnerability is met with vigilance and that silence or absence prompts inquiry. The case also underscored the particular risks faced by children with disabilities. Limited ability to communicate increases reliance on external safeguards. Systems must compensate for that vulnerability through proactive oversight. Absence from services, missed appointments, and lack of external contact require immediate attention. These indicators were recognized as critical signals rather than administrative anomalies. Importantly, the response avoided revisiting settled criminal findings. Legal responsibility remained established. Institutional review served a different purpose, learning, and reform. This separation allowed justice to be enforced while prevention efforts advanced. It reflects a balance between accountability and improvement. The enduring significance of the Marcus Fiesel case lies in how it illustrates the interaction between individual wrongdoing and systemic weakness. Law addressed the former through conviction and incarceration. Reform addressed the latter through changes to oversight, training, and process. Both are necessary to reduce future harm. The conclusion is not celebratory and does not offer closure in emotional terms. It is factual. A child died under state supervision. Responsibility was determined through lawful process. Systems were examined and adjusted. Oversight practices evolved in response to documented failure. These outcomes demonstrate how accountability operates when evidence guides action and when institutions commit to learning. What remains is a set of documented lessons. Protection requires more than records. It requires action when risk is identified, verification when trust is assumed, and escalation when concerns persist. The case stands as a reminder that safeguards must function continuously, not only after harm becomes visible.